really sad today, guys. I never wanted to become that guy. I used to make fun of that guy. I used to think that they were so stupid and unprofessional. Something to be mocked. And I woke up the other day and I realized that I have a problem. So I'm going to confess to you today what that problem is. For the past 6 months, I've been shooting off the LCD of my camera. Just because I bought an R5 and it's great. And like I said, I used to make fun of that person who would do that because it just seems so stupid that they're holding the camera out in front of them and staring at the back of it instead of looking through the hole. But I actually found it because the autofocus system in this camera is so great, it's much easier for me to just move the camera around and look at the screen than it is for me to move myself around. Now that might sound a little bit lazy, but when you're doing a commercial shoot and you're shooting all day, you don't have to contort yourself into weird positions. I think if you've looked at some of the behind the scenes photos on or if you were to, on my Instagram feed, you would see a lot of the time I was in these weird like hunched over positions and all of those things. It's a very difficult thing when you're tall. Also when shooting low, I would have to maybe lay down on the ground and maybe that would hurt my neck or hurt my back or my, who knows, my whatever, if you will. Rib cage, that's what I meant, abdominal muscles. Now I just flip the screen down and look down into the camera and it's great. I can put it wherever. I'm using a tripod a lot now, which is totally different. I was never a big fan of tripods. And that's because one of the great features about this camera is that it will put a mask right there on the LCD, if you will, or in the viewfinder, telling you where the lines are for 8x10. I used to shoot all of the time, and if you gave me a 2x3 box, I would fill it up. And one of the things I was excited about when I was looking at this camera when it first was coming out was that I could mask off the viewfinder to 3x4. I really wish that it was 8x10, but it wasn't. And so I talked about that in my settings video, which I'll link to right here. And somebody said, oh, you should just go into the blue menu and set up the 8x10 guides. And that's what I did. And now everything is great. I find that I am very rarely having to extend my photos in order to hit that 8x10 or 4x5 framing for Instagram. So that's something that I love about the camera. Another thing is the in viewfinder or on the LCD image review. And that is every time you take a photo, it just plays back for you on the back screen or in the viewfinder. And that way, if you're shooting outside, that's when I do use the viewfinder, you can tell right away whether or not you're flash fired, whether or not things are in balance and that sort of thing, and it works out great. Same thing in the studio. You can see if the lights are working and all of that stuff, and it just plays back for you right there. So I think that's a great thing. If you are tethering and you're tethering to Capture One, you're probably going to have to come up with a workaround if you want to do that. And I have a video right here, which you can check out. And that way your photos will end up writing to the card and also your computer that's using Capture One. One of the great firmware improvements that they came out with this camera for, and I don't know if it was the second or third version of the firmware, but that was auto brightness in the EVF. One of the problems that I ran into is that when I was shooting indoors, I would have it turned way down, and then I would go outside and I would have to turn it way up in order to see in the sun. And that would cause my images to be underexposed the next time that I went back into the studio. So having auto brightness in the EVF was a big improvement. Talking about the autofocus once again. I said in my settings video that I turned on the autofocus to be continuous all the time. And one problem that I ran into was that when I did that, my camera would often hunt every time that I set it down in the studio. So I changed the autofocus so that it would initiate whenever I pressed the main or the trigger button. It used to be that I would use my rear thumb to start the autofocus, and that's because with the 5D Mark IV and previous versions and other non-mirrorless cameras, you would often have to focus and recompose. You do not have to focus and recompose with this camera, which is great. So if you're coming from a mirrored camera, this is going to be a great thing for you. And unlike the 5D Mark IV, where I got about 80 to 85% of my images in focus, with this camera, no matter if I'm shooting at f1.2 or f8, about 95 or more % of the images are in focus. I just use the face and eye tracking all of the time. So when I'm reviewing my images before sending them to a client, I don't necessarily have to go through there and wait for every photo to load in my computer to make sure that it's sharp before sending previews to a client. Now I just sort of breeze through it a lot quicker and eliminate those photos where they're blinking or test photos or photos of the ground and that sort of thing. So that has sped up my workflow overall. Of course, the megapixels are great, the flexibility of the file is great, and all of that stuff. Over the past 6 months, I've been asked a lot of times how the battery life is and how it compares. I think that it's been fine. I don't feel like it's been crazy, but I did start monitoring it just so that I could give you some statistics. So this weekend, with eco mode turned on and the camera tethered to Capture One in the studio, I shot about 800 to 1,000 frames over the course of 8 hours on 2 of the new batteries. And I thought that that was really great, and I'm happy with it. So that's perfectly fine. When it comes to video, one of the biggest concerns over time has been overheating. And I did find a workaround, of course, which is to use an external recorder while shooting long-form interviews. And I've also used that on a short film that I'm working on, and that's worked out really well. I find overall that I would much rather shoot 4K Fine or 4K HQ than 8K RAW. The reason is that file, the 4K Fine or 4K HQ that I've often recorded to the Shogun in 422 HQ ProRes, is really a great file to work with, and I really like it. I've used that for some of my YouTube videos. I do use 4K RAW in my C200 for almost all of these talking head videos, and that's just because I really like the quality. But the 8K RAW and the R5, I've used it a couple times, and it's not so good that I'm willing to deal with all of that file size and that sort of stuff. Plus, my Mac, for some reason, will not make proxy files of the Canon RAW files. I can't figure out why, but that has been a bit of a hindrance. I've used the firmware version 3 and firmware version 2, and I can say that in shooting B-roll, I haven't had an overheating issue. So Rob, who shot all the B-roll that you're looking at right now, he just turned off the camera, between takes or whenever we weren't going to be filming for a while, and he was able to shoot for several hours in 8K RAW and never had an overheating situation. Maybe it said at some point that the overheating was down to 15. The timer on the camera of how much longer you could shoot was around 15 minutes. It was perfectly fine. If I could improve this camera in future firmware updates, I would add 4K RAW 60p, 24, and 30. I know it's been rumored, but I think that would be a much better way to shoot than this 8K RAW format. I just think that overall it's too big. So anyway, guys, if you have any questions or comments about the camera, please go ahead and leave those in the description below. Also, if you guys enjoy learning from me in person, I'm teaching workshops again soon, I hope. You can go to johngress.com/workshops to sign up and to get more information. Anyway, stay safe, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.